Welcome everyone. And this video will be looking at chapter 5. Things are getting a little periodical. We'll talk about that in a moment. But our focus is really interest rates. Specifically, we're going to discuss 3 objectives. First is just understanding how rates are quoted. What does it mean when we get a quote from the bank? And how do we actually calculate the effective annual rate of that rate? We'll also apply TBM equations in a periodic format. So this is what we mean by getting periodic. And as we'll discuss, we don't always deal with interest rates on an annual basis. So how do we make that change to periodic rates? And then finally, we will look at an amortization table, a bit of a review, but now a change. Instead of an annual amortization table that we've looked previously, we'll now look at it from a monthly point of view and how that changes, what changes we have to make. So let's begin with the quotes. So usually when we're told of an interest rate, that's usually quoted as an APR. So APR is the annual rate, okay, annual percent rate, and this is usually what's advertised. And as the sort of name suggests, it's based on of interest being computed just once a year, right? So this is what we mean by the annual rate. However, oftentimes interest is not really charged annually. It's charged, might be monthly or bi-weekly. So it's really important to understand how do we change this into a periodic interest rate. And this is going to be very important when you're actually making your calculations. So what we're really trying to do is make a conversion into an EAR, which is the effective annual rate, okay? And don't worry too much about the calculations now, but just recognize that there is a difference between the APR and the EAR, okay? So we're really just trying to figure out really the true cost when we calculate the effective rate. We can also, sometimes you might hear it as the annual percent yield. Okay, so sometimes we see the EAR also considered an APY. Now, yield and rates are sometimes interchanged. Typically, a yield is what your return is. Okay, so you will see that as a sort of perspective from the person actually perhaps making money or profiting from the investment. Versus the rate is what we considered paying an interest rate. Okay, so just think about that, and we'll talk more about yield curves. You can see that as well. Okay, so formula-wise, again, if we have the APR and we basically figure out the number of periods what we actually have to pay that interest rate, we can actually figure out our effective annual rate. And you'll see as we look at an example that the rate will change based off of how often we actually pay interest within that year. Okay. Now a little table here, not quite a periodic table, but it's a periodic interest rate table. Okay, so again, what we're more familiar with is the annual percent rate. So if we have a 5% interest rate, then the periodic rate is 5%, right? So in order to really convert the difference, is we need to figure out M. And what does M really signify? Well, M is basically the number of compounding periods per year. So as you can see, when we're only paying once a year, then that stays at 1, right? So that's what we mean by annual. But as you can sort of look down the list here, if we look at quarterly, we start to recognize that obviously we're paying interest more than once. We're paying it 4 times in a quarter. There's 4 quarters in a year, so that's why we get the 4. Okay, again, this is just a relationship between how many periods you're paying per year. Okay, so again, monthly, obviously, there's 12 months, then we're paying 12 times in a year, and then we finally see daily. So as you can kind of see mathematically, obviously, our rate becomes, specifically when we're looking at the periodic rate, it's going to become less than the annual rate if we're paying more often throughout the year. And this is really important to make sure that that our periods are agreeing with our rates. Okay, and you'll see that when we do our calculations. Now, what is the effect of actually paying more times within that year? Well, just a reminder again, when we're talking about time value money, we need the periodic rate and we need a number of periods, right? So, of course, when we're dealing with the rate and the periods, another reminder, I will remind you again, make sure that your rate is consistent with N. Okay, so in other words, make sure that your number of periods, for instance, if you're doing a quarterly interest rate, make sure the interest rate is periodically the same for that quarter. So don't take the annual rate and use the number of periods as a quarterly. That's not going to be consistent. Now, just those are some disclaimers here, but what we're really trying to figure out is what happens when there's an increase. Okay, so if we increase the frequency of payments made per year, what does that mean? So in other words, if we pay our interest rates annually versus paying our interest rates quarterly, okay, so when we go to quarterly, we're increasing the frequency of payments, right? We're paying 4 times in the year versus just the 1 time. Well, what does that mean for the amount that we're actually paying in total? Well, the total will decrease, okay? So the more that we pay in terms of frequency, the total amount that we pay decreases. The total amount we're specifically referring to as interest, okay? Now, why does that happen? Well, this hopefully we can think back to our loan example when we looked at 3 different types of loans. And if you remember the amortized loan, we actually ended up paying much less. And really it's the same logic, same math really applies, is that the more times that you pay off that interest, you're also, assuming that you're also paying some of that principal off, you're actually paying less and less. Your principal gets reduced less and less. Okay, so every time you're paying more frequently, that means that your principal is also being frequently reduced as well. So the greater the frequency of payments made per year, the lower the total amount paid. And just think of it this way in terms of maybe if it helps you in terms of speed, think about principal as being repaid more quickly, therefore the interest expense is lower. Okay, so that's what we mean by the effect of paying more frequently and how it affects your actual total payment. So, of course, we always have to look at an example here. So this is what our sort of scenario is, and we will compare what happens when we pay it off in sort of different options. So in this case, Jim is borrowing $50,000, and he's going to pay it off in 5 years with an APR. Again, that's that sort of advertised rate of 9%. But the difference that we're going to be comparing is he can either pay it off annually, quarterly, or monthly. Okay, so in other words, he's going to make either annual payments, he'll just pay 5 times. If he pays quarterly, he's going to pay, 4 times 5, and then monthly, we'll get 5 times 12 times. But again, let's look at the numbers just one moment. So really, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to calculate the periodic payment, okay? We have 3 options here. And then we're going to basically compare what happens in terms of how much is he actually paying in total in terms of the cost of this loan. So let's do it. We'll get a little colorful in just a moment, okay? But again, here are sort of our knowns, okay? So we know the loan amount, we know the number, the period, it's 5 years, and the APR of 9%. Now, with the example that is given in here, you will notice we're going to be using a financial calculator in terms of computing the actual results, okay? And I'll bring this up in just one moment. But so again, you can see here, if we were going to use a financial calculator, we would use our TVM buttons. We have present value 50,000. Now this is the green is representing the annual payments. Okay, so this is option number 1 is if we paid annually. So in this case, our number of payments is 5. Okay, we're only making 5 payments. Our interest rate doesn't change. It's going to be 9%. We don't need to worry about the future value because, the future value is going to be 0 because we're paying it off completely. Okay, and something that's a little maybe not familiar with some of us if we haven't used the calculator But basically, this just indicates the format. So in this case, this shows that it's an annual payment. Okay, so when we do that, we get a payment of about $12,854.62. Okay, so that's the payments that we have to make on an annual basis. All right. So again, we're going to make 5 of these payments in order to pay off the loan. So that's option number 1, annual payment. The second option, okay, so we have the call it orange. The orange option is what happens if we pay off this loan, but we make quarterly payments. So again, we're increasing the frequency of payments here, okay, and we can see that by our number of payments, right? So in this case, now we have 20 payments, right? Because remember, we're making 4 payments within the year, and then we have to multiply that by 5 years. So that's the difference here. And just in terms of the calculator, just keep in mind, again, if you want to actually use the calculator, what we're making an adjustment here is the 4 indicates quarterly payments here, okay? So anyway, what we do see is, again, these are our quarterly payments. So we're going to be making this many payments quarterly. We do have to convert that to annual, and we just simply multiply that by 4. Okay, so again, we want to sort of compare, consistently. So we have we're finally going to compare the annual payment when we do it in annual installments. What happens with quarterly payments? Well, again, our annual cost is here, okay, and you can start to see it's a little bit less than the annual payment. And finally, we have the monthly payments. So in this case, again, we're actually increasing our frequency even more compared to the other 2 options. And now we can see we're actually making 60 payments, okay? But we're still trying to pay off the same amount of money. In this case, we're going to compute or get an answer. This is the amount of monthly payments we have to make, okay? So as to be consistent, we also want to figure out what's the total annual payment. So again, because this is monthly, we're going to multiply by the number of months, which is 12 in a year. Okay, so here we are. And now you can start to see that as we increase the number or the frequency of payments, okay, we do see that in total, in this case, Jim is going to pay less total cost for this actual loan if he decides to go monthly. Okay, so that's the example that we have here. Finally, we're just going to talk about the amortization schedules. Okay, so we've discussed this in our previous chapter, and if you can remember, we're going to be paying off the interest, but also we're going to be paying off a bit of the principal every time we pay. Okay, and again, the rationale remains the same in terms of frequency, right? So if we increase the frequency and the size of payments, that means we're more likely to finish paying off that loan quicker, okay? And we can see here that, just like we did previously, schedules are helpful because we can sort of understand, how much we're actually paying each year in terms of principal versus interest, okay? And we'll take a look at that here, okay? Just like we looked at previously, but as you can see here now, it's a monthly instead of an annual. Okay, so again, just a reminder, it's important to make sure that the interest rates are consistent. And you can see how it becomes, particularly when we're looking at monthly periods, there's obviously a lot of payments to be made. Okay, so this is that example of, this is an example paying off a $25,000 loan, but we're doing it over, looks like we're doing it over 6 years, okay, here at a rate of 8%. So 6 years, you're actually looking at 72 payments until we pay it off. And again, this is an opportunity for the consumer to perhaps figure out ways to make adjustments. Maybe they want to pay it off earlier. What happens if the interest rate changes? Okay, because sometimes it might change. How does that affect the principal reduction? All of these can be helpful in analyzing the loan payments and figuring out what is sort of owing. Okay. One thing you'll notice, it's still always equal payments, but what changes is the interest and the principal reduction. Okay, and as you can see, finally, when we get down to the end of the payments, you're really paying very, very little in interest, but you're paying off the majority of the principal. Okay, so that's been our video. We've discussed basically how we hear or quoted our interest rates. Remember, what's advertised isn't actually the effective annual rate, so it's important to make that conversion. Also understand that periodic interest rate must be consistent with the number of payments made per year. And again, we just took a look at an amortization table and understanding what happens when we're looking at monthly in terms of those charges, whether it's compounded annually or monthly. Thanks for watching, and join me for one more video on interest rates. Happy financing!